So welcome everyone. I am so excited to have you all here with me tonight for a Samhain story. As you may know, Samhain is the Celtic festival that was the precursor to Halloween. And the story I'll be telling this evening is very much related to the festival of Samhain, but we may not get to that part until the end. I am Marisa Gowdy, if we have not yet met. I am a story healer and a word witch and a writing coach and a student of Celtic mythology and Irish literature. I have my master's degree from the University College Dublin in Anglo-Irish literature. And in many ways, telling this story to you all tonight is a homecoming for me. It's been a long time brewing in many ways. You may know me from my book, The Sovereignty Knot, A Woman's Way to Freedom, Power, Love, and Magic. In fact, if you've read the book, you may actually realize you've met this heroine we're talking about tonight before. But she's someone I did not meet until I wrote the book. Somehow she snuck past me in all my previous studies of mythology, of folklore, of the goddess in the Celtic world and in Ireland in particular. So I figured that if I have a master's degree in this stuff and I've spent as much time reading it as I have, there's a very good chance you haven't yet met her either. So I'm deeply excited to introduce her to you. And as I hinted before, this is a new beginning for me in a lot of ways, reaching from my book, taking me deeper in and taking all of us deeper in, I hope, into the power of story and mythology, into Celtic myth and to Irish myth, but really as an opening to the universal power of myth that has no country, has no bounds, but is deeply rooted into the earth, that is deeply rooted into the human psyche, into the collective unconscious, into whatever ways we weave the divine into the world. So tonight we're going to settle into a story for 20 something odd minutes. Then I'm going to invite you to reflect upon what came through. If you have a journal or some paper nearby, a favorite pen, have them with you. I know many of those here today are my writers, those who've been with me in the Sovereign Writers Circle, the Sovereign Writers Knot. So that will come naturally to you. But even if you're not a writer, I just want to give you a chance to sit with how this story echoes through for you. Because a story is just a story, and a story is a lot more than a story because it opens doors and opens gateways. And when we give ourselves a chance to pause and think about that, that's when the real magic and the real alchemy begins. So we'll reflect a little bit, just right for maybe 5 minutes or so, and then we'll close with my announcement about the next project I have going. As I said before, I'm not selling anything other than my book. So this is not about a pitch. This is instead about something I'm truly excited about, my next big creative endeavor. And I want you all to know about it and to be part of it. So let's settle in. We will all, get cozy, get something delicious to drink, and know that we all get to go on a little journey together for the next stretch of time. All right, hopefully you see my screen being shared, and we're going to settle in. And I am going to introduce you to one of my favorite heroines from Celtic myth. Fado, Fado. That's once upon a time in the Irish. There was a queen. There was a king. Now she was not just any queen, and he was not just any king. The king, Eochaid Mugmedon, was the rightful chosen king of all Ireland. The queen, Mongfionn, was the fair-haired one. She was the sacred queen. She was the land made flesh, the sovereignty goddess come to walk amongst her people to ensure the health of the earth and all who walked, swam, and flew over it. Now he was a man of his people and of his land. She was a woman of the She and those otherworldly folk who ruled Ireland in their way from far beyond the veil, from beneath the great hills. He was a man of Now, we don't have a story of how they met or what she thought of him after their first date, but we do know this. A sovereignty goddess appeared in human form when it was time to choose the next worthy leader. She would have chosen Eochaid above all the other petty warring kings of Ireland and set him upon the high king's throne at Tara because he was worthy of the land and its people. She chose him because she found him pleasing and because with him she could be satisfied. So yes, we can assume that they wasted no time and made no pretense about waiting till their wedding night. This royal pair, who were blessed by the Great Mother, upon whose back the kingdom was rooted, had 4 fine sons, Brian, Fiachra, Alil, and Fergus. More than just a mother, and more than just an envoy of the divine, Mongfionn was a seer. The stories have it that she had a dream of her sons becoming a pack of dogs, each different in his own way. Brian was such a great hound, he was confused with a lion. Fiachra appeared as a fleet-footed greyhound. Alil became a beagle, and finally, Fergus transformed into a black-mouthed cur. These dream sons turned dogs fought viciously with one another, until, eventually, Brian's lion dog became the clear master. All 3 brothers bowed before him and offered him their forever fealty. Now, dreams and visions were currency back then, and they were respected in a way that would seem foreign to most of us now. Mongfionn's dreams came directly from nature, from the mother of all nature, from Mongfionn's own divine nature. And so one might assume that was that. Royal family life would unfold according to the patterns as old as the earth itself, as old as the seasons. This story would follow the pattern of the goddess and her chosen king. This story would develop as naturally as boys and dogs and other growing things. Now it's true, Eochaid and Mongfionn lived as the rightful king and queen of Tara for some time, ensuring the harvest from the fields and the peace between the people, or as much peace as there was on a land so accustomed to men making war upon her from shore to shore. There was always a limit as to what the goddess could do when her people took up sword and spear and found they could rule by strength rather than a commitment to balance. In her own divine human way, Mongfionn did what all goddesses do, tilting the world through the seasons, holding the harvests, making space for the frosts, and drying the tears of every woman, child, and elder who lost more than they had to give in the endless battles and strife. Well, sort of, but we'll get to that. Now, goddess blessed as he may have been, King Eochaid was no more than a mortal man. One day, he set his eyes upon the king of the Saxons' daughter. Some say that he fell for her because he knew their union would secure a peace with the powerful king from across the sea. Others say that it was an early sign of the colonizer making its way into the heart of Ireland. Still others say it was merely lust, because even a king chosen by the goddess of sovereignty herself can be a man corrupted by his own power, who will claim a woman with a pretty face and a head of jet black curls. Eochaid took Karen Kashtuv to become his wife because in those days, a man, particularly a royal one, was allowed to take up with another woman, even when he was already wed. Queen Mongfionn was a divine being born of the other world, but she had possession of a human heart and mind herself. She made this new young thing with her English rose good looks work like any kitchen girl. Karen spent much of her time carrying water from the well up the slopes of the royal Tara fortress. When she wasn't lugging a pail, she was lying in the king's bed. We know little of what Karen thought of her time in Tara, whether she felt like a willing lover or an unwilling captive. We do know 2 things. Slavery and hostage taking were part of Irish culture at this time, and the stories say that Karen was terrified of Mongfionn. In time, there was a son born to Karen. We cannot know how she felt, whether she loved the king, whether she was always homesick, whether King Eochaid Mugmedon lived up to his name. because that last bit, Mugmedon, it means slaveholder. The old stories do say that Karen was never given time to rest, even as her belly grew heavy. She gave birth upon the slope of the great hill of Tara in the midst of her rounds. A baby who would be named Niall was born right there in the grass. And then she left him there in the fields and went on with her work. The scribes tell us that it was her fear of Queen Mongfionn's wrath. Perhaps Karen just had no interest in raising up a son of Ireland. Saxon that she was. Maybe she was an unnatural woman who didn't know how to love. Or it could be that her heart was too broken by her own painful circumstances to offer care to another. Maybe she couldn't bear the thought of raising a child to be a slave. A poet who would eventually be known as a prophet came by. His name was Torna, and he took the baby in his arms, wrapped him in his cloak, and instantly decided that this was a very good, very important deed. He took the child home to raise, but only after declaring that someday this infant would grow to be king of all the land, and his descendants would rule Ireland forever after. After this, the sweetness was stolen from the marriage of Mongfion and Eochaid, and poor Karen still toiled with her endless buckets of water. A decade and more passed. Those boys grew to be men. When Niall learned of his esteemed parentage, he came back to the castle to claim his royal rights and to elevate his mother to her noble place as consort to the king. They must have made an awkward trinity, Eochaid and Mongfion standing beside Karen, who was now dressed in a royal purple mantle upon her son's command. Though you may have grown up on the tales of firstborn sons inheriting the throne, it was not so in ancient Ireland. The king chose his successor, and everyone had something to say about who would wear the crown. Dear listeners, I do invite you to keep that in mind as the story unfolds. Mongfion had always favored her son Brian, and it was no secret that she assumed he would take the kingship of Tara and all of Ireland when her husband took his last one-way journey to Tirnanog and the Western Isles. Imagine how her entire vision of the world would have been upended when this new young man appears and claims his right to a royal father, sets his own mother beside the queen, and asserts his right to inheritance. The men who wrote down this tale in their Yellow Book in Lecan way over in County Sligo say that Mongfion was incensed at all this. But they're the same ones who say it was her insecure, queenly jealousy that had a noble princess like Karen toiling like a lowly slave. They seem to have forgotten the meaning of the king's second name. The monks who put this story on paper would have it that all the events in this story were set in motion by Mongfion's petty cruelties and mad bids for control. Who's to know? But let's see what the next scenes might reveal. At this point, Niall's star was on the rise. He proved himself to be an equal to those brothers who had been raised in the luxuries of the royal household. The crowd seemed to like him best. When the Druids set up challenges to determine the kingly potential of Eochaid's sons, Niall always seemed to come up on top. Now, no one was particularly happy about the state of royal affairs on the day when the Druids sent the 5 young men out on a hunt. They were directed to carry only their weapons and leave all other supplies at home. They wandered deep into the woods, beyond the territory they knew so well. It was growing dark, and all 5 young men were tired, hungry, and thirsty. It was the thirst that drove them close to madness. At last, they reached a clearing, and there was a stout old well at its center. They rushed forth to satisfy their thirst, but a low, gravelly voice stopped them before they could cup their hands to drink. "I am the guardian of the sacred well. You may drink your fill and more," the voice croaked, "but you must kiss me first." Stepping from the gloom was the most loathsome of loathsome hags. Nose hooked to hairy chin, milky eyes, mossy teeth, she was the stuff of young men and young women's nightmares. Brian stood nearest to the old woman. He was rather accustomed to the pretty young things who hung about Tara. He'd rather die of thirst than give himself to such a wizened crone. He told her so and went off to sulk and lick his own dry lips. Picture a similar scene with the next three brothers. Thirsty, arrogant lads and an old woman who stands her ground, wrapped not in an embrace, but in a lonely passion for her work as protector of the sacred well. Youthful stubbornness and ancient dedication side by side. But then the youngest brother, Niall, came forward. For the fifth time, the guardian makes her offer. You may drink all that you like, but you must kiss me first. He kissed her. The old woman was transformed into a siren who would give any modern fantasy heroine a run for her money. And the two didn't stop when they hit first base. He had met the sovereignty goddess, and she had found him more than worthy. In honeyed tones from her honey mouth, this exquisite creature whispered Niall would become king, and she would soon come to Tara to rule beside him. But now, he and his brothers, his less worthy, certainly not king material brothers, would return to Tara and assure everyone that the question of succession was assured. Brian and his brothers must have hung their heads as they walked behind the newly triumphant Niall. Mongfionn's screams must have been heard all the way in Scotland when she heard the news. King Eochaid was still healthy enough, so nothing would change immediately, except that the entire future of Ireland had just been rewritten in a way that did not suit the current queen. Again, there's a lull in this story, but surely it was even less harmonious than that during the young prince's childhood. Mongfionn, a goddess turned queen, could presumably only be left to her anger and powerlessness. And so she turned to the last identity left to her, witch. In time, Eochaid did die. A testament to her power, Mongfionn was able to install her brother, Crichton, on the throne, rather than see Niall assume it immediately. How a sovereignty goddess has a mortal brother is a bit of a puzzle, but if the ancient scribes were not troubled by this, let's agree not to worry about it either at this point, shall we? So while her brother held the throne, Mongfionn sent Brian, who she still believed was the most worthy son to take up her divine sovereign legacy. She sent him to Scotland to study and build his skills as a warrior and leader. He was gone for 7 long years, and when Brian did return, his uncle Crichton refused to pass the kingship on to him. Now this would not do. Niall had disappeared from the scene, at least for the time being, and the queen could not stand fighting amidst her own house, amidst her own blood kin. Mongfionn arranged a great feast of reconciliation. She invited her sons, her brother, and all the rest of the hangers-on. Somehow, Niall and Karen's invitation was lost in the post. Sad, but c'est la vie. At the feast, she offered her brother a royal cup. Wise to her ways, perhaps he was of the she after all, he said, "Of course, but you must drink first, dear sister." And so she did, and so he did, and so they died. One sip of water to make a king, one poisoned chalice to take down a queen, a king regent, and all the dreams of divinely blessed sovereignty. Even after Mongfionn's great sacrifice, Niall did end up taking his father's crown. He ruled for his own handful of years, and his descendants held that seat for more than 6 centuries beyond that. Those druids who declared Niall's sons would hold Ireland forever were not strictly correct. But as we sit here now, I'd wager everyone has met an O'Neill, but very few have ever heard whisper of Mongfionn, the goddess, queen, witch. Now, I am merely the storyteller. It is not for me to have the last word. That is for Mongfionn to do. She is the one who told me to tell it straight, and so I did. Well, I stuck to the sources as much as my modern, independent, women's studies trained mind would allow. Now it's time for Mongfionn to tell it true. Mongfionn speaks. Yes, I asked you to tell it straight, and so you did. And yes, I asked you to tell it true. And it's also true that this is actually my work to do. You could not have told them about my life before the page, before the scribes got hold of my storyline and twisted the shape of my lifeline. I had my own long life beneath the hills, on that other side of the veil where the Tuatha De Danann still dwell and thrive. I was one of the great goddess Danu's children. I still am. There was a time when we walked the land freely, perfectly at home in our own divine form. But times changed. The old people went, new people came. We found a way to adapt and make do, to occasionally make our way into the world, to help the cycles of the seasons, the cycles of the moon, the cycles of birth and death and rebirth. A set of my sisters and I were called to do the magical hag to princess to queen act. I fared worse than most, as you've heard, but generally was rather a nice deal, the sovereignty goddess gig. You spoke little about the land herself, about the great green hills, the blue of the sky, the wet of the rain, the glow of the sun, and the flow of the rivers. You all seem to think that mythology is a great bunch of she said, he said, when truly it's the story of the earth and all creation, with just a few characters sprinkled in, because you all seem so drawn to the drama they wreak upon the earth. And of course, your soul may wander my Ireland freely, but your feet do not. There's an absence there that no amount of words can change, but I trust you'll make it to Tara again and begin to tell the story true in time. The stories you had to work with didn't make much of our sacred land either, though the scribes did lavish their attention on the ways I overworked that pitiable scrap of a girl in hopes she'd shed that babe of hers before it could draw breath. I noticed you didn't linger on such details. I cannot pretend ignorance nor innocence there. I knew everything that went on at Tara. I was the queen in every sense, from the baking of bread to the invitations to the royal table, to the lowest servant in the yard. None of it escaped my notice or attention. And I did despise that my husband would replace me. I did not take the form of a woman and take to living on this side of the veil to become some discarded husk or to be made a redundant old bit of baggage before my time. I stand in power as maiden, as mother, as crone, or as princess, queen, and wise woman, as I hear you tell it. But I play those parts and embody those magics on my own terms and in my own time. No man or earthly power structure is going to tell me who to be or who will be sovereign. After this story, you may think me petty and cruel. I wasn't going out of my way to harm the girl. I had an entire country on my mind. And yes, it was a cruel country where people were snatched and sold, and yes, enslaved. I did not do enough to stop that. That may be my one regret. Yes, there was a limit on divine intervention even in those days, but I always had pillow talk. I could have done more as a wife and queen to change my husband's way of keeping and gaining power. With a few millennia of retrospection, I can declare I would not find a man by the name of Mugmedon, slaveholder, to be worthy of my beloved land now. Do remember this. A goddess is a force of birth, and she is also a force of death. That woman and her son, they both serve the will of men. Whether they knew it or not, they were pawns in the game of the short-lived power brokers, the foolish lads grown into even more foolhardy men who thought to remake this land in their own image. And then, sweet storyteller, you left out the part where I commanded my sons to trick Niall by calling him into their quarrel and turning their knives upon him. Maybe you didn't want to paint me as a would-be murderess, seeing as you brought all these people here to hear of some forgotten heroine, some goddess queen witch who deserves to be remembered. Maybe I did order my boys to take Niall down. Maybe they did not because they were too weak. Maybe they had purer hearts than I. Maybe they believed in that oath they'd made when they're young to their young brother. Maybe they believed those bedtime stories I'd told them, the stories that were actually a true account of how I met your father. Maybe they were raised on a faith so strong they never learned to think for themselves. I, my dear, have been the hag. I have been the transformed maiden who blithely offers a kiss and the friendship of my thighs to the worthy will-be king. I have held the throne and its power. I have wielded it with wisdom, with fairness, and in the name of the old ways, in the name of the great mother Danu, who cares for this land like she would care for her dearest child. And I, my dears, have always had a name. That mossy-toothed old besom who guarded the well, she was no sister of mine. She was sister to no one. The nameless prop they offered you, she has only ever taken breath on the page. The lads who ran the ancient O'Neill dynasty's propaganda machine, they dreamed her up, you see. Those boyos were never by a sacred well with my sons, but they were in the room where it happened. They conducted the backroom deals that took the throne from my worthy eldest son, Brian, and put Niall in charge. They made up a tale after the fact to justify the way they subverted the will of the goddess. They dared to make up a goddess to justify placing their boy on the throne, all to suit small-minded, greed-driven human designs. And they dared to do it in my name and invent a story of my demise as a common poisoner. I did drink a poisoned cup. It took me down just as it took down Crichton, my beloved brother. And of course he was of the fairy folk, just as I was. I wouldn't have passed the throne on to just anyone while Brian was off learning the ways of statecraft. Crichton and I may have had a disagreement because that brother of mine did rather like his stint on the throne at Tara. The boys of our family did have it a little rough. They didn't have many chances to emerge into this world and try their hand at sovereignty. I can barely blame him. For Crichton and me, it was a pact finely sealed. We had watched the men of Tara and the rest of the warring families run rampant over the old beliefs in sovereignty. We'd watched them upend the vital, delicate balance that must be maintained between the gods, nature, and the people who rely on the goodwill of those gods and the health of this land. We chose to return to our mother, our sisters, and our brothers in the realm of the Sidhe to restore our sanity and decide how we'd emerge again to find another worthy ruler on another day. And now, most say we gods and goddesses have had our time. We passed the mantle long ago. I haven't dreamed of putting on my human guise for centuries. We work in whispers now. We distrust our stories. We distrust stories for obvious reasons, but we know we depend upon them for our very survival. In my day, we didn't have words like patriarchy, capitalism, industrialization, not that I spoke English, But we had men who would wrest control from the vaster, unseen hands of nature and the divine. We had women who went along because they trusted men to butter their bread more than they trusted their own sense with the cows. If you've ever met an Irish heroine, you'll know she always has a mighty way with the cows and can lead the herds or make a miracle with milk like you've never seen. Remember this, never trust a woman who relies on a man for all her butter. Let me close here as we stand on the cusp of Samhain. This is my time, you know. I hate much of what those monks say of me in their yellowy old book, but I'd rather like the way they tell it at the close. Then, on the eve of Samhain precisely, Mongfionn dies. So this is the death of Mongfionn the Banshee. Hence, Samhain is called by the rabble Mongfionn's feast, for she was a witch and had a magical power when she was in flesh. Wherefore, women and the rabble make petitions to her on Samhain. Oh, the parties they would throw, those wild women and the rest of the rabble. You do know what rabble means, yes? It's the ordinary folk, those who live close to the earth and close to the mother. The rabble are those that the manufactured O'Neill dynasty feared and despised because the women and common folk knew the truth. They knew that I was sovereignty. They knew that I was goddess made flesh. They knew that I would tend to their needs like a sacred queen devoted to her lands and her people. To celebrate my feast is to celebrate the bonds that exist between the sacred and the everyday, between the gods and the land and the people who depend upon them both. To celebrate my feast is to celebrate the Great Mother and all those who fight fiercely to protect her. I was a goddess. I was a queen. I still am. And I will take their label of witch and make it holy, because that is what women and the rabble do when we are misunderstood, accused, and betrayed. I offer my magic, all divine and human as it may be. By my magic, I will ask you to transform the story, my story, your story, poor Karen's story, because I cannot believe she wanted to be a henchwoman to those who would tear the world from the hands of its divine caretakers and tilt all creation out of balance. I can only believe she wanted what we all do, a place to call home where she was safe and seen and trusted and loved. So mote it be. And therein concludes, for now, the story of Mongfionn. Because I believe that all our stories that we hear want to reflect back to us something that we know of ourselves and something we don't yet know of ourselves. I invite us all to pause just for 5 minutes. I've got a couple, many of you know me as the writing coach, who always has a writing prompt. I've got a couple here. And I invite you just to sit with whatever question feels most interesting to you. You can always come back to these. I invite you to do so. We have several days between now and Samhain, and the season lasts a bit after that. Sit with this idea of what came through for you. You might want to talk back to a character to tell them exactly what you think. You might want to talk as a character. As we can see, Mongfionn was certainly willing to do that for me and through me. She, in fact, came and tapped on my shoulder, or appeared to me at least, at the fall equinox fire. She came through and told me I needed to keep telling her story in new ways. And so this has unfolded. And the announcement I have in a few minutes has unfolded because of her inspiration. So perhaps you want to talk as a character here, whether it's Mongfionn or Yoki or Karen or Niall or the rabble. You may want to write into this question of what does it mean for you to be part of women and the rabble, if you so identify as someone who might want to honor Mongfion and offer your petitions to her on Samhain. So let's just spend 5 minutes. Take up a pen if you have one, your journal if it's nearby, or merely just close your eyes and allow yourself to be with this story before we rush on to the next thing. There's so much to be said about allowing a story to settle into your bones and doing it consciously. So 5 minutes and we'll come back together. So we'll just give it another minute more. If you have an idea that's come up that you want to share in the chat, we'd love to see it. Perhaps you want to mention which character spoke to you or who you needed to speak to. And remember, this doesn't have to be the end. I hope that this story sticks with you, that there are elements that keep showing you more of themselves. Perhaps you'll keep seeing them appear in daily life. We'll just write for another minute more, another few seconds really, and then we'll call up. The next bit is something I want to show to you and share with you all. Mm. Mm. And I'll be sure to make these slides available for you too, so you can come back to the question when I send out the recording. So I can't really keep it a secret anymore. I'm going to go ahead and tell us all what's going on next. And it's a big deal for me. And I hope that it ends up being something that's going to make a difference to you as time goes on. And that is that in some ways, it's almost a cliche to say I'm launching a podcast, but it's also really coming through as the truest and deepest next expression of my work. I am so excited to announce that on Imbolc, on February 2nd of 2022, I will be launching Not Work, a podcast about untangling our myths and rewriting our stories. And it seems more than perfect that it's actually on this 2-year anniversary of the Sovereignty Knot. And because we trust in sovereign time and divine timing, I realized, yes, I needed 2 years to let that book cook out in the world before really stepping into a new world and a new genre to come and tell stories every week. The way I'm envisioning this is that I will be sharing a story a lot like this one, and then diving in with a guest. Someone I really admire, someone who I know has particular insights into the themes that might be contained in a story, and talking about why they still matter. Because I do believe that mythology offers us endless numbers of guideposts and pathways on how we meet the human condition, but even more importantly, how we live on this earth and live with this earth and honor all of our interconnections between every living creature that exists here. We are at a moment of deep and powerful and terrifying planetary inflection. And we are all called to show up and make our magic that will help transform the future in our own way. And for me, I recognize that so much of it is by calling people to the ancient stories, because they all exist inside of us still. They all want our attention because they can be those frameworks that we use to get closer to the earth, to the mother again, and recommit ourselves to this understanding that sovereignty is about interconnection to the planet. It is not about ruling upon it and finding all new ways to have dominion over all of nature and all of nature's creatures. So there's going to be a buildup before this. Funnily enough, when Mongfionn came to me on the equinox, she was quite insistent, and she was actually a little irritated with me because in the Sovereignty Knot, I actually do say, there's a line that pretty much says straight out, do me a favor and please do not forget her name, because I feel she is a goddess and a figure that we're being called to reclaim. And I think I sort of did forget her for a while. You know, we had that minor thing, we're having that minor thing like the global pandemic that takes our eye off the ball a little bit and changes a lot of the stories. But when she came through, she was deeply insistent, and she wanted this to come forth in this moment. And I believe that, you know, we're all walking with the guides and the gods and the ancestors, and that they are calling for our attention now more than ever, because they know what it's like to live with the earth without all of the devices and intermediaries that we have grown to rely on. The irony is not lost on me that it is going to be a thing that you will listen to on your device, but we are of this modern world too, and we are meant to continue to make magic and move with it. So initially I thought I had to launch the podcast itself on Samhain, and I tried to really get myself psyched for a 5-week turnaround on a project that has some enormity to it. But then I recognized that, oh wait, I'm actually supposed to give myself some space to craft this as I would any truly important and beloved project. So that means over the next 3 months, I get to do the work of developing it. I get to do the work of calling it into form and into creation. And because we know that we, again, live in this modern world, in 2022, presumably we will still be using Facebook, even though as of today, Facebook may be called Meta sometime soon, if you saw the news. I did create a Facebook group where I would love to share with you what comes through as I develop the podcast, new stories I'm playing with, new images, perhaps introduce you to some of our guests. I am truly excited for the people who are going to be on the podcast. I have an interview scheduled for tomorrow. So it's really happening. It's really beginning. It just gets to be a beautifully, not particularly long incubation process, but throughout this period, we know that from Samhain through till Imbolc is the dark time of the year. You know, if you're in Ireland or you're in Scotland or in Britain, you realize that in many ways, November 1st truly is their start of winter. And it lasts until February 1st. That's when the flowers start to reemerge. We live in a slightly different calendar in different parts of the world. Certainly in the Northeast here, we're still in autumn here in the States. But there, it really means something, that this is this in-between time. This is a time for gathering in and telling stories and, looking within ourselves, because nature is showing us that she is taking a rest. She's looking within and going down to her roots, going deep into the belly of the earth so that she can slumber. But it's in that belly of the earth that we find our stories, that we find these ways to make meaning, these ways that meaning has always been there waiting for us. What happens if we come and untangle it and unspool it and recraft it and weave something new? So let me pop the link into the chat if anybody is interested in joining the group. I will make it easy for you because right now it's so small. It's only me in there that it's hard to find if you search it. But let me go and I'm going to drop this in the chat. If you want to go ahead and join the group, I'll put a link in the podcast in the email I'll send out afterwards as well. And I'm really excited to just start a conversation there. And as we can mature, I hope to get off of Facebook and Facebook groups, but for now, that's where the majority of us are. And, we, as the goddess was able to only change so much in the world of men, we can only do so much. So we will go along with them in their way and go there and play around. In the meantime, before the podcast launches, I do have a book out. If you haven't read it before, I would deeply love to offer that to you as something you might want to check out. I'm happy to, I do something called writing a sovereignty note. That is a 1-card tarot reading that I send out with my signed copies of the book. So it's coming on to the holidays. I was wonderful to send so many of those as gifts for folks, for readers last year, if you're interested. And of course, I do have room on my calendar for one-on-one consultation. If you feel like you have stories inside of you, something like this or something completely different that you are trying to make space for, I would love to speak with you. And I don't think I have a link right here, but I'm happy to set up like a 20-minute conversation to talk about how you might want to call stories in to your own life and work. And because really, I have traveled a long way from my origins as a story-loving, story-seeking, story-writing girl who became that student who studied all of this Irish stuff so deeply. I wandered away for a long time, both in the academic world and then as an entrepreneur. And I'm realizing and coming home that it's these stories that matter the most, because they're the places where we find meaning. And when we allow ourselves to focus on and be in the magic of these stories, it's phenomenal how so much of the practical stuff will fall into place, because we're no longer at war with ourselves, and we are offering ourselves that gift of fullest attention, that gift of our full humanity, and we're honoring our passions and where we're pulled, because it's when we diminish and try to disregard our passions that's where so much of the conflict happens. That's where so much of the pain and anguish really come in and dig in. So I just want to look at a couple of everyone's comments in the chat. If anybody wants to drop in anything about their thoughts on the story before we close, I'd love to hear. Pearl loves the rabble. Yes, it is an utterly delicious word. Where might I find this story? So in it, the form that I worked from is in it's the Celtic manuscript, the Irish manuscript, the Yellow Book of Lecan. And I worked from the Whitley Stokes translation that was from the late 19th century. It's in a periodical called the Revue Celtique. I spent a lot of time parsing through where was the English, where was the French, and where was the Irish in this particular manuscript. But I can send out the link to that if you want to read the original form. But this was very much based on what we truly know of Niall's origin story and of the brief mention of Mongfionn. Carrie, I love that Mongfionn spoke to you. Never assume. Do you mind if I read this? Is that okay? Okay, it's chatted only to me, so I want to make sure it's okay. Never assume that what you think you know is the truth. The ancients have powers beyond your conception. The worlds exist beyond your narrow perception. Ask and we will share, listen and we will tell. Be and we will join you. Buried under your mask as a goddess, as a queen and a witch. Free her. We await your arrival. Oh, that feels like a blessing for all of us. Thank you, Terry. Oh, this is why I get to hang out with wise women. I get to read their words and share them with other people. Oh, you're welcome, Judith. You're welcome. Oh, Laura says she got shivers when she started speaking. I assume you mean Mongfiend. Yes, she's quite a power to behold, is she not? So I want to thank all of you so much for taking time to be here with me, to come to what's, the closest thing we have to live events and live storytelling and live theater right now in many ways. I still remember my high school drama teacher used to put on the back of all our programs, even a terrible night at the theater still beats a night out in front of the TV, a night in front of the TV. It's a very 90s concept at this point, but I'm just so grateful to all of you for playing me instead of Netflix. So I invite you to keep playing with these stories, with this story. It is the first of many. I promise many more. I am just deeply thrilled to be able to share with you my passion and my joy, and to think that she is speaking to you through me is really the greatest privilege. And I'm kind of a little bit gobsmacked that I get to do this as a grown-up. So thank you all for being part of the magic. I do hope you'll join me in the Facebook group. I will keep you informed on email, because presumably if you're here, you're on my list, but I'd love to just talk with you about it and share what comes through, because this is just, it's good stuff. And I'm grateful. Oh, Laura, I'm so glad that your dad listened to. That's amazing. Yes, Judith, I will include the source book. I have it in the strangest form. I'm going to search it out so that maybe you all don't have to read it I did it in a very convoluted way, but I got it for free. It's so old, it is out. It's you can find it in what's that? freely available. I'm not finding the word. The former librarian in me is embarrassed that I can't think of the word, but yes, I will definitely include the link to finding that original Mongfiend story. And oh, Irene, I'm so glad you were here. Oh, it's wonderful. It's a blessing. All right, we're going to start and exactly on an hour. I want to thank each and every one of you again. And let me know if you have any questions and any more thoughts. If Mongfiend whispers to you, please tell me. I'm collecting Mongfiend stories now, and not that many of us know her. So we have to share it with each other. So on that note, I thank each and every one of you, and I hope to see you soon. Mwah. Bye, everybody. Good night.